Chapter 48. A leader from England, Mrs. Hannah T. King, a MacDonald from Scotland, a Welsh Queen, a representative woman from Ireland, Sister Howard, a galaxy of the sisterhood, from many nations and tongues, incidents and testimonials. Here the reader meets an illustration of women from many nations baptized into one spirit, and bearing the same testimony. Mrs. Hannah T. King, a leader from England, shall now speak. She says, in 1849, while living in my home in Durnford Dale, Cambridgeshire, England, my attention was first brought to the serious consideration of Mormonism by my seamstress. She was a simple-minded girl, but her tact and respectful ingenuity in presenting the subject won my attention, and I listened, not thinking or even dreaming that her words were about to revolutionize my life. I need not follow up the thread of my thoughts thereafter, how I struggled against the conviction that had seized my mind, how my parents and friends marveled at the prospect of my leaving the respectable church associations of a lifetime and uniting with such a low set, how I tried to be content with my former belief, and cast the new out of mind, but all to no purpose. Suffice it to say I embraced the gospel, forsook the aristocratic associations of the high church congregation with which I had long been united, and became an associate with the poor and meek of the earth. I was baptized November 4, 1850, as was also my beloved daughter. My good husband, although not persuaded to join the church, consented to emigrate with us to Utah, which we did in the year 1853, bringing quite a little company with us at Mr. King's expense. Since her arrival in the valley, Mrs. King has been constantly prominent among the women of Utah. Her name is also familiar as a poetess, there having emanated from her pen some very creditable poems. Scotland comes next with a representative woman in the person of Elizabeth G. MacDonald. She says, I was born in the city of Perth, Perthshire, Scotland, on the 12th of January 1831, and am the fifth of 10 daughters born to my parents, John and Christina Graham. My attention was first brought to the Church of Latter-day Saints in 1846, and in 1847 I was baptized and confirmed, being the second person baptized into the church in Perth. This course brought down upon me so much persecution, from which I was not exempt in my own father's house, that I soon left home and went to Edinburgh. There I was kindly received by a Sister Gibson and welcomed into her house. After 2 years had passed my father came to me and, manifesting a better spirit than when I saw him last, prevailed upon me to return with him. He had in the meantime become partially paralyzed, and had to use a crutch. 2 weeks after my return he consented to be baptized. While being baptized the affliction left him, and he walked home without his crutch, to the astonishment of all who knew him. This was the signal for a great work, and the Perth branch, which previously had numbered but 2, soon grew to over 150 members. In May, 51, I was married to Alexander MacDonald, then an elder in the church. He went immediately on mission to the Highlands, but in 1852 he was called to take charge of the Liverpool Conference, whither I went with him, and there we made our first home together. In May, 53, I fell downstairs, which so seriously injured me that I remained bedridden until the following marvelous occurrence, one Saturday afternoon as I was feeling especially depressed and sorrowful, and while my neighbor, Mrs. Kent, who had just been in, was gone to her home for some little luxury for me. As I turned in my bed I was astonished to behold an aged man standing at the foot. As I somewhat recovered from my natural timidity he came towards the head of the bed and laid his hands upon me, saying, I lay my hands upon thy head and bless thee in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Lord hath seen the integrity of thine heart. In tears and sorrow thou hast bowed before the Lord, asking for children, this blessing is about to be granted unto thee. Thou shalt be blessed with children from this hour. Thou shalt be gathered to the valleys of the mountains, and there thou shalt see thy children raised as tender plants by thy side. Thy children and household shall call thee blessed. At present thy husband is better than many children. Be comforted. These blessings I seal upon thee, in the name of Jesus. Amen. At this moment Sister Kent came in, and I saw no more of this personage. His presence was so impressed upon me that I can to this day minutely describe his clothing and countenance. The next conference, after this visitation, brought the word that Brother MacDonald was released to go to the valley, being succeeded by Elder Spicer W. Crandall. We started from Liverpool in March, 54, and after the usual vicissitudes of sea and river navigation, finally went into camp near Kansas Village on the Missouri. From there we started for Utah in Captain Daniel Carnes' company, reaching Salt Lake City on the 30th of September. In 1872 my husband was appointed to settle in St. George, where we arrived about the middle of November. Here we have since remained, and I have taken great pleasure in this southern country, especially in having my family around me, in the midst of good influences. The people here are sociable and kind, and we have no outside influences to contend with. All are busy and industrious and striving to live their religion. The wife of the famous Captain Dan Jones, the founder of the Welsh mission, is chosen to represent her people. She thus sketches her life to the period of her arrival in Zion. I was born April 2d, 1812, in Clady, South Wales. My parents were members of the Baptist Church, which organization I joined when 15 years of age. In 1846, several years after my marriage, while keeping tavern, a stranger stopped with us for refreshments, and while there unfolded to me some of the principles of the, then entirely new to me, Church of Latter-day Saints. His words made a profound impression upon my mind, which impression was greatly heightened by a dream which I had shortly thereafter, but it was some time before I could learn more of the new doctrine. I made diligent inquiry, however, and was finally, by accident, privileged to hear an elder preach. In a conversation with him afterwards I became thoroughly convinced of the truth of Mormonism, and was accordingly baptized into the church. This was in 1847. After this my house became a resort for the elders, and I was the special subject of persecution by my neighbors. In 1848 I began making preparations to leave my home and start for the valley. Everything was sold, including a valuable estate, and I determined to lay it all upon the altar in an endeavor to aid my poorer friends in the church to emigrate also. In 1849 I bade farewell to home, country and friends, and with my 6 children set out for the far-off Zion. After a voyage, embodying the usual hardships, from Liverpool to New Orleans, thence up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to Council Bluffs, some 50 fellow passengers dying with cholera on the way, in the early summer I started across the plains. I had paid the passage of 40 persons across the ocean and up to Council Bluffs, and from there I provided for and paid the expenses of 32 to Salt Lake City. Having every comfort that could be obtained, we perhaps made the trip under as favorable circumstances as any company that has ever accomplished the journey. For her magnanimous conduct in thus largely helping the emigration of the Welsh saints, coupled with her social standing in her native country, she was honored with the title of the Welsh Queen. The title is still familiar in connection with her name. Since her arrival in Zion she has known many trials, but is still firm in the faith of the Latter-day work. The following is a brief personal sketch of Mrs. Howard, an Irish lady, of popularity and prominence in Utah. Presuming there are many persons who believe there are no Irish among the Mormons, I wish to refute the belief, as there are many in our various towns, most staunch and faithful. My parents, Robert and Lucretia Anderson, resided in Carlow, County Carlow, Ireland, where, on the 12th of July 1823, I was born. In 1841 my beloved mother died, and in the same year I married, and went to reside in Belfast with my husband. My father, who was a thorough reformer in his method of thought, originally suggested several governmental and social innovations that were afterwards adopted by the government and the people. He died in 1849. My parents were Presbyterians, in which faith I was strictly brought up, but I early came to the conclusion that my father was right when he said, as I heard him one day, "The true religion is yet to come." After my marriage I attended the Methodist Church mostly, led a moral life, tried to be honest in deal, and did, as well as circumstances would allow, unto others as I would they should do to me. I thus went on quietly, until the true religion was presented to me by a Mr. and Mrs. Daniel M. Bell, of Ballagrot. My reason was satisfied, and I embraced the truth with avidity. In February, 1858, my husband, myself and our 6 children left Ireland on the steamship City of Glasgow, and in due time arrived at Council Bluffs. Starting across the plains, the first day out I sustained a severe accident by being thrown from my carriage, but this did not deter us, and we arrived all safe and well in Salt Lake City on the 25th of September. In 1868 I went with my husband on a mission to England, had a pleasant, interesting time, and astonished many who thought no good thing could come out of Utah. While there I was the subject of no little curious questioning, and therefore had many opportunities of explaining the principles of the gospel. There was one principle I gloried in telling them about, the principle of plural marriage, and I spared no pains in speaking of the refining, exalting influence that was carried with the doctrine, wherever entered into in a proper manner. Sister Howard has not exaggerated in claiming that the Irish nation has been fairly represented in the Mormon Church. Some of its most talented members have been directly of that descent, though it is true that Mormonism never took deep root in Ireland, but that is no more than a restatement of the fact that Protestantism of any kind has never flourished in that Catholic country. Of the esteemed lady in question it may be added that she is one of the most prominent of the women of Utah, one of the counselors of Mrs. President Horn, and a leader generally, in those vast female organizations and movements inspired by Eliza R. Snow, in the solution of President Young's peculiar society problems. Scandinavia shall be next represented among the nationalities in the Church. The Scandinavian mission has been scarcely less important than the British mission. It is not as old, but today it is the most vigorous, and for the last quarter of a century it has been pouring its emigrations into Utah by the thousands. Indeed, a very large portion of the population of Utah has been gathered from the Scandinavian peoples. The mission was opened by Apostle Erastus Snow, in the year 1850. One of the first converts of this apostle, Anna Nilsson, afterwards became his wife. Here is the brief notice which she gives of herself. I am the daughter of Hans and Caroline Nilsson, and was born on the 1st of April 1825, in a little village called Dalby, in the province of Skåne, in the Kingdom of Sweden. At the age of 17 I removed to Copenhagen, Denmark. There, in 1850, when the elders from Zion arrived, I gladly received the good news, and was the first woman baptized into the Church of Latter-day Saints in that kingdom. The baptism took place on the 12th of August 1850, there were 15 of us. The ordinance was performed by Elder Erastus Snow. Some time after this we hired a hall for our meetings, which called public attention to us in some degree, whereupon we became the subjects of rowdyism and violent persecution. One evening in particular, I recollect that I was at a meeting in a village some 8 miles out from Copenhagen. As we started to go home we were assailed by a mob which followed and drove us for several miles. Some of the brethren were thrown into ditches and trampled upon, and the sisters also were roughly handled. Finding myself in the hands of ruffians, I called on my heavenly Father, and they dropped me like a hot iron. They pelted us with stones and mud, tore our clothes, and abused us in every way they could. These persecutions continued some weeks, until finally stopped by the military. In 1852, 1 week before Christmas, I left Copenhagen, in the first large company, in charge of Elder Forsgren. We encountered a terrible storm at the outset, but were brought safely through to Salt Lake City, where I have since resided. A Norwegian sister, Mrs. Sarah A. Peterson, the wife of a well-known missionary, has remembrance next. She says, I was born in the town of Murray, Orleans County, N.Y., February 16, 1827. My parents, Cornelius and Carrie Nelson, were among the first Norwegians who emigrated to America. They left Norway on account of having joined the Quakers, who, at that time, were subject to much persecution in that country. In the neighborhood was quite a number of that sect, and they concluded to emigrate to America in a body. As there was no direct line of emigration between Norway and America, they purchased a sloop, in which they performed the voyage. Having been raised on the coast, they were all used to the duties of seamen, and found no trouble in navigating their vessel. They also brought a small cargo of iron with them, which, together with the vessel, they sold in New York, and then moved to the northwestern portion of that state, and settled on a wild tract of woodland. 8 years afterwards my father died. I was at that time 6 years old. When I was 9 years old my uncle went to Illinois, whence he returned with the most glowing accounts of the fertility of the soil, with plenty of land for sale at government price. The company disposed of their farms at the rate of $50 per acre, and again moved from their homes, settling on the Fox River, near Ottawa, Illinois. Here, when 14 years of age, I first heard the gospel, and at once believed in the divine mission of the prophet Joseph, but on account of the opposition of relatives, was prevented joining the church until 4 years later. In the spring of 1849 I left mother and home and joined a company who were preparing to leave for the valley. On our way to Council Bluffs I was attacked with cholera. But there was a young gentleman in the company by the name of Knut Peterson, who, after a season of secret prayer in my behalf, came and placed his hands upon my head, and I was instantly healed. 2 weeks after our arrival at the Bluffs I was married to him. We joined Ezra T. Benson's company, and arrived in Salt Lake City on the 25th of October, and spent the winter following in the old fort. In 1851 we removed to Dry Creek, afterwards called Lehigh. My husband was among the very first to survey land and take up claims there. In 1852 he was sent on mission to Norway. During the 4 years he was absent I supported myself and the 2 children. In 1856 he returned, much broken in health because of his arduous labor and exposure in the rigorous climate of that country. In the fall of 1857 my husband added another wife to his family, but I can truly say that he did not do so without my consent, nor with any other motive than to serve his God. I felt it our duty to obey the commandment revealed through the prophet Joseph, hence, although I felt it to be quite a sacrifice, I encouraged him in so doing. Although not so very well supplied with house room, the second wife and I lived together in harmony and peace. I felt it a pleasure to be in her company, and even to nurse and take care of her children, and she felt the same way toward me and my children. A few years afterwards my husband married another wife, but also with the consent and encouragement of his family. This did not disturb the peaceful relations of our home, but the same kind feelings were entertained by each member of the family to one another. We have now lived in polygamy 20 years, have eaten at the same table and raised our children together, and have never been separated, nor have we ever wished to be. Mrs. Peterson is the present very efficient president of the Relief Society at Ephraim, which up to date has disbursed over $11,000. Here will also properly appear a short sketch of Bishop Hickenlooper's wife Anne, who made her way to Zion with the famous handcart company, under Captain Edmund Ellsworth. She had left home and friends in England in 1856, coming to Council Bluffs with the regular emigration of that year, and continuing her journey with the handcart company. As before stated from her journal we quote, "After traveling 14 weeks we arrived in the near vicinity of Salt Lake City, where President Young and other church leaders, with a brass band and a company of military, met and escorted us into the city. As we entered, and passed on to the public square in the 16th Ward, the streets were thronged with thousands of people gazing upon the scene. President Young called on the bishops and people to bring us food. In a short time we could see loads of provisions coming to our encampment. After partaking of refreshments our company began to melt away, by being taken to the homes of friends who had provided for them. I began to feel very lonely, not knowing a single person in the country, and having no relatives to welcome me. I felt indeed that I was a stranger in a strange land. Presently, however, it was arranged that I should go to live with Mr. Hickenlooper's people, he being Bishop of the 6th Ward. After becoming acquainted with the family, to whom I became much attached, his first wife invited me to come into the family as the bishop's third wife, which invitation, after mature consideration, I accepted. I am now the mother of 5 children, and for 20 years have lived in the same house with the rest of the family, and have eaten at the same table. My husband was in Nauvoo in the days of the prophet Joseph, and moved with the saints from winter quarters to this city, where he has been bishop of the 6th Ward 29 years, and of the 5th and 6th Wards 15 years. Several of the sisters who first received the gospel in England and emigrated to Nauvoo during the lifetime of the prophet, claim historic mention. Ruth Moon, wife of William Clayton, who during the last days of Joseph became famous as his scribe, was among the first fruits of the British mission. With her husband she sailed in the first organized company of emigrant saints on board the North America. Here are a few items worth preserving, from her diary of that voyage. Friday, September 4, 1840. Bid goodbye to Penwortham, and all started by rail to Liverpool, where we arrived about 5 o'clock, and immediately went on board the packet ship North America, Captain Lober, then lying in Prince's Dock. Tuesday, September 8. At 8 o'clock the ship left the dock, was towed out into the River Mersey, and set sail for New York. On getting into the English Channel we were met by strong headwinds, which soon increased to a gale, compelling the ship to change her course and sail around the north coast of Ireland. The decks were battened down 3 days and nights. During the gale 4 of the principal sails were blown away, and the ship otherwise roughly used. Saturday, September 12. The storm having abated, we had a very pleasant view of the north part of Ireland, farms and houses being in plain sight. Tuesday, September 22. About 11 o'clock the company was startled by the ominous cry of the chief mate, "All hands on deck," and buckets with water. The ship had taken fire under the cook's galley. The deck was burned through, fire dropping on the berths underneath. It was soon extinguished without serious damage having been done. Sunday, October 11. Arrived in New York. They journeyed thence by steamer up the Hudson River to Albany, by canal from Albany to Buffalo, by steamer thence to Chicago, and by flatboat down the Rock River to Nauvoo, where they arrived November 24. Elizabeth Birch, who was born in Lancashire, England, in 1810, was a widow with 4 children when she first heard the gospel, which was brought to Preston, by the American elders, in 1837. The new religion created great excitement in that section, and people often walked 10 miles and more to hear the elders preach. She was baptized at Preston, on the 24th of December 1838. In 1841 she sailed in the ship Sheffield for New Orleans, and thence up the Mississippi River in the second company of saints that sailed for America. In the fall of that year she was married to Mr. Birch. Her husband being one of those designated to help finish the temple at Nauvoo. They were in the city during the famous Battle of Nauvoo. Her recollections of that perilous event are very vivid. During the fight one of the sisters brought into her house a cannonball which she had picked up, just from the enemy's battery. It was too hot to be handled. They reached the valley in 1850. Concerning polygamy, she says, in 1858, my husband having become convinced that the doctrine of celestial marriage and plurality of wives was true, instructed me in regard to it, and becoming entirely satisfied that the principle is not only true, but that it is commanded, I gave my consent to his taking another wife, by whom he had 1 daughter, and again in 1860 I consented to his taking another one, by whom he had a large family of children. These children we have raised together, and I love them as if they were my own. Our husband has been dead 2 years, but we still live together in peace, and each contributes to the utmost for the support of the family. Lucy Clayton, wife of Elder Thomas Bullock, was the first of the saints to enter Carthage jail after the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram. She tells a graphic tale of the excitement of the people of Carthage on that occasion, how they fled, panic-stricken, from their homes, led by Governor Ford, thinking that the people of Nauvoo would wreak vengeance upon them for the murder that had been committed in their midst. She was also among the remnant of the sick and dying saints on the banks of the Mississippi, after the expulsion, when they were miraculously fed by quails that alighted in their midst. This is an often told wonder, and is classed with the immortal episode of the children of Israel, fed by quails in the wilderness. The wife of Thomas Smith is also entitled to historic mention. Her husband, in the early days of the British mission, made a great stir in England, as a Mormon elder, and she was with him in his ministry. He bore the euphonious epithet of Rough Tom. Having both the genius and fame of an iconoclast, he disputed, on the platform, with the same sectarian champions who met the great infidels Holyoke, Barker, and Bradlaugh. His career as a Mormon elder was quite a romance, and in all its scenes his wife, Sister Sarah, was a participant, though she was as gentle in spirit as he was bold and innovative. A famous career was theirs, and the spiritual power and signs that followed them were astonishing. He was full of prophecy, and she spake in tongues. He also cast out devils by the legion. The spirits, good and bad, followed him everywhere. It is of those thrilling scenes that his widow now loves to speak, as a testimony of the power of God, and of the signs following the believer. No sister from the old country could be chosen as a better witness of the spiritual potency of Mormonism than Sister Sarah Smith Wheeler. Sister I.S. Winterholm, from Denmark, was brought into the church, in Copenhagen, through a series of spiritual experiences of unusual power and interest, and, throughout her entire life since, she has been remarkably gifted with the power of healing, the interpretation of tongues, etc. Concerning the gift of tongues, she testifies that at a ward meeting in Salt Lake City she heard a lady manifest the gift by speaking in the dialect of Lapland, which she was fully competent to translate, being conversant with that dialect, and which the lady in question positively knew nothing about, as she had never seen a person from that country. Sister Winterholme has been a resident of Salt Lake City since 1862, and a member of the church since 1853. As a representative from Scotland, Sister Elizabeth Duncanson, who is one of Zion's nurses, may be mentioned. A remarkable incident of her life is the fact that at about the identical moment of the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, she, in her home in Scotland, saw the entire tragedy in a dream. She told the dream to her husband at the time. Both of them were members of the church, and they were much dispirited with their forebodings concerning it. In about 6 weeks, by due course of mail, the tidings reached them. Herself and husband reached Utah in 1855, and in that same year she was ordained, by President Young, to the office of nurse, which she has since most acceptably and skillfully filled. Another sister from Scotland, Sister Mary Micklejohn, since 1856 a resident of Tooele City, and also one of Zion's nurses, shall here be mentioned. While residing in Bonhill, Scotland, herself and husband were baptized into the Mormon Church by Elder Robert Hamilton. Her husband at once became active in the work of spreading the gospel, and was soon the recipient of the benefits of the gift of healing, to a remarkable degree. By an accident one of his feet was crushed and terribly lacerated by being caught in a steam engine. The physicians determined that the foot must be amputated in order to save his life, but the elders thought differently, and after administering to him, they called a fast, for his benefit, among all the branches in the neighborhood, and the presiding elder prophesied that he should so completely recover the use of his foot as to dance on it many times in Zion. This has been literally fulfilled. Mrs. Micklejohn is the very acceptable president of the Tooele Relief Society, which position she has held since its organization in 1870. It is also noteworthy that among the sisters is Mrs. Josephine Essenbach, once a Russian countess. With the instincts of her rank, she took it upon her to officiate for many of her aristocratic compeers of Europe, in the beautiful ordinance of baptism for the dead. The Empress Josephine and Napoleon's wife, Louisa of Austria, were among the number. Also Elizabeth of England. The reader will have noticed in the sketches of the sisters, both American and foreign, frequent mention of the gift of tongues. This seems to have been markedly the woman's gift. One of the first who manifested it approvingly was Mother Whitney. She was commanded by the prophet Joseph to rise and sing in the gift of tongues in the early days of Kirtland. She did so, and Joseph pronounced it the Adamic tongue, or the language spoken by Adam. Parley P. Pratt afterwards gave a written interpretation of it. It was a story, in verse, of Adam blessing his family in Adam-ondi-Amen, the Garden of Eden in America. As an instance in which the gift of tongues proved of decidedly practical value, we transcribe the following incident, which occurred near Council Bluffs, in the history of a girl of 17 by the name of Jane Grover, afterwards Mrs. Stewart, from her journal. One morning we thought we would go and gather gooseberries. Father Tanner, as we familiarly called the good, patriarchal elder Nathan Tanner, harnessed a span of horses to a light wagon, and, with 2 sisters by the name of Lyman, his little granddaughter, and me, started out. When we reached the woods we told the old gentleman to go to a house in sight and rest himself while we picked the berries. It was not long before the little girl and I strayed some distance from the rest, when suddenly we heard shouts. The little girl thought it was her grandfather, and was about to answer, but I restrained her, thinking it might be Indians. We walked forward until within sight of Father Tanner, when we saw he was running his team around. We thought nothing strange at first, but as we approached we saw Indians gathering around the wagon, whooping and yelling as others came and joined them. We got into the wagon to start when 4 of the Indians took hold of the wagon wheels to stop the wagon, and 2 others held the horses by the bits, and another came to take me out of the wagon. I then began to be afraid as well as vexed, and asked Father Tanner to let me get out of the wagon and run for assistance. He said, "No, poor child, it is too late." I told him they should not take me alive. His face was as white as a sheet. The Indians had commenced to strip him, had taken his watch and handkerchief, and while stripping him, were trying to pull me out of the wagon. I began silently to appeal to my Heavenly Father. While praying and struggling, the Spirit of the Almighty fell upon me and I arose with great power, and no tongue can tell my feelings. I was happy as I could be. A few moments before I saw worse than death staring me in the face, and now my hand was raised by the power of God, and I talked to those Indians in their own language. They let go the horses and wagon, and all stood in front of me while I talked to them by the power of God. They bowed their heads and answered, yes, in a way that made me know what they meant. The little girl and Father Tanner looked on in speechless amazement. I realized our situation. Their calculation was to kill Father Tanner, burn the wagon, and take us women prisoners. This was plainly shown me. When I stopped talking, they shook hands with all three of us, and returned all they had taken from Father Tanner, who gave them back the handkerchief, and I gave them berries and crackers. By this time the other two women came up, and we hastened home. The Lord gave me a portion of the interpretation of what I had said, which was as follows. I suppose you Indian warriors think you are going to kill us? Don't you know the Great Spirit is watching you and knows everything in your heart? We have come out here to gather some of our Father's fruit. We have not come to injure you, and if you harm us, or injure one hair of our heads, the Great Spirit shall smite you to the earth, and you shall not have power to breathe another breath. We have been driven from our homes, and so have you. We have come out here to do you good, and not to injure you. We are the Lord's people and so are you, but you must cease your murders and wickedness. The Lord is displeased with it and will not prosper you if you continue in it. You think you own all this land, this timber, this water, all the horses. Why, you do not own one thing on earth, not even the air you breathe. It all belongs to the Great Spirit. Of similar import and fraught with similar incidents as the preceding, are the testimonies of Mercy R. Thompson, sister of Mary Fielding, Mrs. Janet Young, of South Cottonwood, Elizabeth S. Higgs, of Salt Lake City, and Gillette Morgan, of Milk Creek, originally from England, Zena Pugh Bishop, for 28 years a member of the church, Anna Wilson, of Taylorsville, originally from Sweden, Mary C. Smith, a sister from Wales, Elizabeth Lane Hyde, a sister from South Wales, Sister M. Bingham, an aged saint from England, Sister Mary T. Benson, of Taylorsville, for 32 years a member of the church, Mrs. Isabella Pratt Walton, of Mill Creek, Mrs. Margaret Pratt, from Scotland, and many more, concerning whom a faithful record might profitably be made.